the people of sake actually brought me into sake.
Back in 1988, this place was actually in Ginza on the main drag.
At first it was kind of soy sauce, it was miso.
To the point where it actually changed my life.
New Year's Day 1989.
Not just sake as a beverage, but all the culture and history.
Hi, my name is Frank, and you are listening to Sake on Air. Justin is away this week because he's doing some interpretation
for the JSS Sake and Shochu Academy.
So I've prepared the interview we did with Brian Polen of Brooklyn Kura back in September. I hope you enjoy the show.
And so, welcome, Brian. You're here. You're in Japan. You're out enjoying the festivities of Japan and all that it has to offer. Why don't you tell everybody who you are, what it is you do, and what the heck it is that brought you out here?
My name is Brian Polen. I'm the president of Brooklyn Kura, New York State's first sake brewery. We launched essentially in January of 2018, and I'm here to support a friend's brand and event in Osaka and Saitama called Smorgasburg.
Yeah.
And then in kind of taking the trip, I mean, I'm using the 5 days I'm here, which is really no time, to meet with some of our important partners that are here. Now, we're not able to meet with everyone, and this was kind of a last minute trip. So, I mean, I really haven't done justice to the group of people that have been supportive of us, but I think we'll be spending more time, I think, coming out here and talking about what we're doing and trying to get support and involvement to a certain degree here. Because, we're advocates for sake as an industry, and we're in a really cool place to do a good job of that, assuming that we have the support in Japan that we need.
It's not your first time in Japan, obviously.
It is not, no.
So when did you first come to Japan? Was your first visit here?
Oh, wow. So probably 2010, not terribly long ago. And it was just my wife and I touring and traveling. I mean, the significant trip was when I came in 2013 and I met our brewer, my partner, Brandon. And I mean, that trip was for a mutual friend's wedding, but we ended up touring through Kyoto, Shirakawa-go, Takayama, and Tokyo.
Yeah. So when you guys came, were you looking at sake in any capacity whatsoever? It was just something that you both happened to stumble upon on that trip, or was it something that had been kind of brewing and for a little while somewhere?
No, so there was no, I mean, we had never met. So Brandon and I had never met. And I was working for American Express, leading a product and technology organization. He's a biochemist and was working in research in Portland, Oregon. And I think, when you're here for an extended period of time and you're trying to kind of eat locally and drink locally, I mean, you are very quickly exposed to a quality of sake that just isn't readily available in the US, unless you're in places like New York City and San Francisco. And even in those places, there are some barriers to entry. So we were just surprised and impressed by the quality, range, and affordability, and started to talk about how and if we could make something like this. But also, like, to your point about understanding markets earlier, like, what was the market, or is the market at the time, what was the market like in the US? And so we kind of made an agreement among ourselves that we were going to go home and try and make sake and learn a little bit about the market in the US. I mean, it turns out in the US, there is a lot of sake, the bulk of which is produced in California by Japanese-owned breweries, which I didn't know, I didn't realize. And there was this like burgeoning class of craft breweries that were either really closely connected to Japan. They were either Japanese brewers or married to Japanese, had spent time at breweries, but it was still a relatively small community. And so we started making sake at home, really just as a hobby and to understand the process mechanically a little better. with no real ambition of starting a brewery. And then when the quality of that exercise was better than we expected, then we started to spend a lot more time thinking about kind of the business and kind of effort around starting a scaled facility.
And so you're talking about, you said, but 2013 then was about,
Exactly.
did you say when you were back doing that? And so 2013 U.S. market is actually probably even a little different than what it is now to a degree. I mean, maybe not so much on the production end, maybe more on the consumer end, but.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's so I guess the timeline in simpler terms is Brandon and I met in 2013 here, went home, and over the course of the next 2 years, pretty much experimented with brewing sake at home. Once we hit certain like quality hurdles, it was like, well, I think we can do this, raise money for it, and actually kind of build a business around it. And so in 2016, really, we started the company in earnest. We left our jobs and got a small facility in this trendy, interesting, like maker food hub in Brooklyn called Bushwick, Food and Art Hub. And the goal over that period of time was to understand the market more. And the market, yes, had changed between 2013 and 2016. But overarching, like across categories, whether it be food or drink, there's this premiumization that's like going on. You know, as consumers, we were kind of very much familiar with the fact that, I mean, the craft beer audience and the fine wine audience were very informed about what they were drinking and where it was sourced from, and had an interest in exploring other categories of drink. And then there's like a broad affinity for everything Japanese, right? That we all know and see. And so it's always been surprising to me that sake hasn't done a better job of kind of piercing the consumer consciousness and definitely being something that people perceive as substitutable for craft beer and fine wine.
Yeah, so that's
Exactly.
What is the brewing scene like in Brooklyn? Like, you know, just general brewing scene. How would you describe it?
I mean, it's relatively, I mean, if you think about it in terms of per capita, and you look at beer and wine and now sake, I mean, there are relatively few breweries. But it's, I mean, it's a very sophisticated market. So New York City in general has access to some of the best goods and services in the US. And that includes hundreds of labels of Japanese sake. And so I think the quality of the products that come out of breweries in New York City is necessarily like very high, because the expectations of New York City consumers is very high. And so, I mean, our motivation to start the brewery in Brooklyn, I mean, there are a bunch of different reasons for that. But ultimately it was a large market with a sophisticated consumer base that we thought was ready, if not a little annoyed by the fact that they didn't have access to a sake brewery. And so it just, I mean, we spent about a year in a small facility, and I mentioned this to you guys. It was really about scaling recipes, but it was also about kind of what's our supply chain look like? Where are we getting rice and yeast and tane, and what's our water look like? Sourcing equipment, right? Figuring out our branding and marketing strategies, starting to get people interested in what we were doing.
with regards to the actual brewing process. In Japan, the process has become, it's starting to change a bit, but pretty much determined as to when and how a lot of things are done, and it tends to be rather labor intensive and tends to demand a great deal of time and energy and resources for an extended period of time, which in a lot of cases means when the brewing starts, everything else kind of stops when it hits brewing season. How do you guys handle sort of that production and sort of that work-life balance and things like that? Whereas here, for me, I was working, for us, it was 7 days a week, and then you're getting up, every couple hours and checking on koji and things like that, and that's just the way you run for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months straight. On a smaller scale, are you guys looking at sort of how to revolutionize not just the market, but also the work-life balance and sort of how that works in the U.S. as well, or is that something that?
I mean, we work 7 days a week.
Yeah.
I mean, and yes, producing sake for us is equally labor intensive, and we are not super mechanized or automated. And I mean, I think as we stabilize and hit some of the revenue targets that we have, we can start investing a little bit more in automation, but that's tough to do when you're trying to bootstrap a business like this. I think that'll become easier as we strengthen relationships with Japanese producers as well, right? As they have surplus equipment that to date has been unaffordable for us, but might become accessible to us. So Brandon's continuously trying to optimize the process. So like both me and our assistant brewer and like the people we'll be bringing on to kind of reduce the effort or kind of bring a semblance of work-life balance, it will be achievable. I mean, we're producing year-round too. So I think that allows us to kind of be more measured in terms of we're not putting together 3 batches every day. We don't have a 3rd edition, a 2nd edition, and a 1st edition happening every day. We're not pressing necessarily in parallel, though we need to do some of that, which is really a planning challenge. But yeah, I mean, it will serve us no good if we burn out too quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's so one of the big challenges here in Japan is how do you get more people to want to be involved in sake production? Yeah, and just in that process, because it's an amazing process, but it requires a lot.
Exactly.
It requires a lot of investment on a personal level and on a energy level and all these other things. And so while it's for some people, you know, it's tough to rope people into something that really does require 24-hour attention, 7 days a week. And so that's one thing that me personally, I'm really excited for the overseas market to hopefully find a way to step outside of that box a little bit and then hopefully come up with some different solutions for maybe how to manage that, whether it's through technology or whether it's through some other means that, that's just kind of a personal dream.
I mean, as a business, you can always take a hit on the margin and invest in people. Yeah. So reduce from an overall perspective the time and energy commitment from each person individually. And I mean, we're not really in a position to do that now, but we want people happy and engaged and coming back every day, motivated to make the best sake that we can.
So Brian, yeah, you were talking about all the challenges and all the little hurdles you had to overcome and sort of sift through as you were getting started. And you were talking about fundraising and getting that all together and figuring out how you're going to pay for this operation. Yeah. And so in doing that back in 2014, 15, when you're starting to look at, we want to do this, we want to do it in Brooklyn, we have an idea as to what this is going to look like and the potential for this. What was it like going about and fundraising, communicating to people? So we're going to go and do craft sake and we're going to do it in this place for these people. What was it like communicating the value and the potential, and sort of what was the response to that?
I mean, the sad reality of fundraising is it's really about the network of professionals that the people doing the raising have. Yeah. So I was pretty lucky to have a group of people that trusted me and kind of the vision that we had, and as a result, kind of converting them to investors was relatively straightforward on the scale that we were raising money. The additional thing is just having a competent team. So Brandon and I have a very complementary set of skills. He's been brewing for years, and the science of sake production is a real driver of the final quality of the sake being produced. And so the combination of our professional relationships and experience made it, of course, it was challenging, right? But achievable. And so I think when I talk to people about fundraising, I mean, ideas matter, right? Like you have to be able to set the stage. Like there's this beautiful thing that people are familiar with, but for some reason or another hasn't done a good job of penetrating the U.S. market, that we think the U.S. consumers are ready for it, and we think that we can develop a brand and a product that will be exciting to them and kind of further the movement of sake, both domestically and internationally. And so that, in addition to being a consumer brand, in addition to being a decent business, if you can hit the scale that like we need to, was sufficient to get people excited about it. And then also, I mean, it's something that we make, right? So there's a story in that for people that at the early stage that were like interested in being involved could get behind and be supportive of. So, I mean, we were lucky. We had the right relationships. I think we were our timing was fine. And so the combination of those things made it achievable. What I'd say is, and this is one thing that I try and, we've had support both in the US and from Japan, like the entire way. It's been remarkable. I never would have anticipated the level of involvement and encouragement and technical support and potential financial support from people both in the US, but I guess more exciting is people in Japan for what we're doing. Whether it be Brandon spending time at Miyasaka Shuzo or Takashima Shuzo, or us having kind of friends in the business that manage like large groups of restaurants in Japan that have tremendous amount of experience with Japanese sake makers, or it be people like John, Matsuzaki-san. I mean, the list is long. Or even people who are active in the market in New York and in the US, ranging from folks at Mutual or Wismatech, or it's like, I can't understate like the level of support and encouragement. I think that's ultimately like people like Chizuko Helton or Tim Sullivan. I mean, these people that have been in the market for a long time, Chris Johnson, that are advocates of sake and want to see the entire market grow, and as a result are just tremendously encouraging and supportive. And so like the domestic sake market, over starting to build relationships there, get people involved in the process, having them as champions of our product has been essential. But also, I mean, trips like the trip I'm on today and the relationships that I've been fortunate enough to build, and Brandon's been fortunate enough to build since we started in Japan, have been tremendous. So neither of you guys, you or Brandon, were food industry related beverage. I mean, Brandon, he was brewing for a long time, right, home brewing and stuff, but you guys weren't necessarily in that market to begin with. So you were really starting from scratch, having to build that network from scratch and figure out how to make it happen on a technical level as well. And so when you're coming to Japan, you start to explore those things and you don't have that market. What was that initial response like when you're reaching out to people initially? What were the types of people or places, or what sort of response did you get? I think people were cautiously optimistic, right? I mean, this is a product-driven business. And so I think as we started to scale recipes in our small facility prior to the current facility, and people started to interact with the product, and, I think in general, U.S. consumers and even Japanese brewers and sake consumers have relatively low expectations of non-Japanese produced sake. And so exceeding those low expectations is doable, especially if you take that effort very seriously, which is what we did. So I think people were cautiously optimistic, and then as we kind of persevered, we overcame different hurdles toward actually operating a commercial brewery, I mean, people were a part of the ride, and as a result felt more invested. As a result, were willing to contribute more time and energy and support. And so I think there was no kind of one thing that we did other than try and be transparent about what we're doing and the challenges we're having. And yeah, neither of us have been in this industry, but like ultimately, it's practical problems that any business faces. You care about the product, you care about the customer, and you want to do the best by both, right? While also maintaining the integrity of whatever the history of the product you're producing is. And so we always talk about having a tremendous respect for Japanese brewing and Japanese sake. We're not Japanese. We don't speak Japanese, right? We don't read and write in Japanese. We don't have kanji or hiragana, katakana on our labels. But I mean, we do make a relatively traditional style of sake and follow a very traditional process. And I think the combination of those things also has kind of been exciting for like the traditional producers in Japan, and also for the folks in the US market as well.
Other than the language barrier, which was very interesting to hear about, and I assume that would have been one of the challenges that you faced. What other challenges did you face in the early days?
So I mean, I like to kind of run through things as logically as possible, right? So like from a production perspective, I mean, we make a junmai style of sake, right? So we need rice, we need water, we need yeast, and we need tane. So like first question is like, what the hell are those things, and where do we get them, right? And of course, it was a much more like involved process figuring that out. But I mean, finding sources of tane in Japan, because finding yellow koji anywhere else is tremendously difficult if it exists at all. Finding suppliers of rice that were cost effective and producing a quality at kind of the mill rates that we wanted for our first sets of products.
So are you guys using U.S. grown rice then?
Yes.
Very nice.
We use, there's Yamada Nishiki grown in both California and Arkansas, and then we also use Calrose. So in today's products, our koji is made with Yamada Nishiki, and our kakamai is made with Calrose.
Right. Obviously, you don't need kind of as premium quality rice for the kakemai, because you're essentially just going to kind of dissolve it into the fermentation, and it's going to, the most essential thing is the koji, right?
Yeah. So I mean, Brandon talks about this a lot, and I mean, the first, second, third most important things are the koji. But I mean, really, what I think is interesting is people ask about the terroir of sake, and ultimately, there are 1,000 decisions that a brewer makes. Each one is important. You might not necessarily be able to link each one to the final product, but it's about being very thoughtful and methodical about each one of those decisions. So we have these 4 ingredients, and we have confidence in them. New York City water is fantastic. It's soft in the spectrum, not dissimilar from a lot of the water that's used across sake breweries in Japan. And we, of course, filter out iron and manganese and then chlorine and particles. But we try and maintain the integrity of New York City, Brooklyn water. But I guess back to your point, it took a long time for us to have confidence in the supply chain. And the relationships were more challenging because of the obstacle of not being able to speak the language, but it gets back to this idea that people have been incredibly supportive, and so they're willing to spend the time and energy to overcome that language barrier and be supportive of our project.
And I think passion probably translates in any language, right? If you've got passion for sake, I mean, it doesn't matter if you speak Japanese, English, or French, or whatever.
Let's say, you were and you were talking about sort of staying true to the tradition and those sorts of things, and really trying to communicate that. And you're in a really interesting position in that that's something that so many Japanese producers really focus on, but also struggle with a lot, because there's so much to say, there's so much to share, and how do you distill that down into something that is palatable for what are actually a lot of early consumers or people who are really just most of the market is just getting in touch with sake in a real way. And so how do you really distill that down for people? And so, like, for example, when people come to your brewery and they come and they sip a few things, what is the message, or what is it you try to get them to take home with them aside from a bottle of sake?
Yeah. I mean, I guess before responding directly to that, building a sake business in the U.S. is difficult. Like I said, all those reasons, and we've had tremendous amount of support and been able to achieve that. But whether it be regulatory or kind of the supply chain or equipment sourcing, or even just producing a product that people are excited about. So I mean, we've definitely had our work cut out for us. But you're absolutely right. Like, ultimately, it's how do we convince people to drink a product, even if it was perceived very well in Japan. Like, that doesn't necessarily mean people are going to be buying it in our tap room in Brooklyn. And so we do try and simplify the messaging. We do try and present sake in a similar way to wine and craft beer, in that you walk into our tap room and you might confuse it for a beer brewery or a winery, with the exception of the vineyard. But and we try and use language that is familiar to people, so that it isn't such a foreign thing. We aren't necessarily presenting our sake in small ceramic glasses. We do in wine glasses. And people ask us all the time, like, how should I drink this? And it's like, move it, smell it, taste it like you would a craft beer or a fine wine. Because, I mean, even though there are differences in the process and history, I mean, ultimately, I mean, those three things in my mind are almost perfectly substitutable. They're all delicious. They all do well with certain styles and types of food. They're all fun to drink. They're all social. They're all kind of the product of craftsmen. And so, I mean, those are kind of the basic criteria for a thing that, like, a sophisticated consumer in a place like New York City is interested in.
Is there a community in the US for microbrewing that you've kind of, that you've built and kind of it becomes like a support network? You can all kind of communicate with each other, or on the other hand, is it more like a rivalry and you don't talk to each other much? Or how is the relationship with other microbrewers, and how important has that been to kind of supporting you in what you've been doing?
I think it's been tremendously important to us. So we work in a world where the sake market in the US is small, and so fighting with each other over it makes zero sense. It's counterproductive at best. And so there's a difference between, like, the collaboration that happens across people that are on the retail side and distribution side, people that I mentioned in New York, like the Chizuko Heltons or the Chris Johnsons, where, like, there's a real community of folks that might not necessarily work for the same companies, and maybe operating with different motivation or kind of goals, but work closely and support each other. From a brewing perspective, I mean, we look at it a bunch of different ways. We've had a bunch of support, whether it be from Takashima Shuzo or Miyazaki Shuzo or Nambu Bijin and Kuji-san, or like the list is long. And we also have had support from people who kind of were in the craft sake movement in the U.S. before we were. When it comes like, where did they source their rice washer, right? Or like kind of what final temperature profiles are they fermenting their ginjo with yeast, whatever, at, and like what challenges have they experienced? I mean, like just that type of back and forth. How are they making their koji? What decisions? I mean, I think we've been very fortunate to benefit from like really open and supportive brewers in the U.S. And so we try and pay that forward. I mean, the other motivation beyond just I think it's the right thing to do and Brandon thinks it's the right thing to do is that we want craft producers in the U.S. to be making a high quality product. So not only, it doesn't need to be traditional, right? There's a whole range of folks in the U.S. that are approaching it from a beer brewing perspective to, like us, a more traditional approach to producing sake, all of which are fine. It's just the ultimate product kind of reflecting
keeping the bar high,
yeah,
so that whoever encounters it wherever is going to have
Right.
a positive experience.
Recognition,
experience, yeah.
right? Getting the recognition kind of at the right levels.
Exactly.
People know what craft sake is and what it represents, and what
Exactly.
they should expect. Because
Exactly.
first expectations, of course, are what drive the market, aren't they?
Well, I mean, there's pros and cons to the fact that most people in the U.S. have had sake.
Yeah.
I mean, they've had kind of what is a table wine equivalent that typically is served warm, and I mean, served in small ceramic glasses and shot or dropped in beers, all of which is fine because it's an initial level of familiarity. But I think the sake that we're drinking right now, which is fantastic and complex and refreshing and definitely conducive to a good time and a great conversation, I mean, is the type of stuff we want people to get more and more familiar with.
You're in a really interesting position where you are able to create American sake.
Yeah.
You're on the ground floor of creating a sake, not just an American sake, but American sake culture.
Yeah.
Which that's when you really start looking at the long-term vision. That's where there's a lot of excitement, I feel like. So there's a lot of power there.
I mean,
That's really, really exciting. Yeah.
So there's a lot of responsibility there.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a Japanese audience on the majority, and we take our responsibility very, very seriously. And like I said, we benefited from talented people like folks like Todd Bellamy, who worked with Dovetail in Boston, and their expertise and experience in Japan and also in producing sake in the U.S. We've just been so while there is this huge opportunity to define sake for U.S. consumers, we are keeping our focus pretty narrow on the experience in our facility, in our tap room, and with our product, trying to keep the language around all aspects of that simple and relatable. Also, not doing simple things. Like, it's not like we changed the name Junmai or Junmai Ginjo. I mean, we have like simple, descriptive, like collateral for people who want to learn a little bit more about the process. I mean, you wouldn't call Hefeweizen something else. You wouldn't call Chardonnay something else. So, I mean, as we introduce new products, we're introducing new concepts potentially. But I mean, ultimately, it's like, it's as simple as sake is good and has a complexity, depth, and breadth of fine wine and craft beer, and there's no reason you shouldn't be drinking it. So it's that easy.
Yeah, absolutely. I said a lot of times it seems like, getting back to sort of a lot of Japanese producers and their communication marketing, it's almost, there's a lot of overthinking.
Yeah.
You tend to find when there's so much that's you find is sort of encapsulated in this little bottle, and how do you communicate that to someone when you've got so much passion and so much dedication to something? So on like a marketing perspective, what were you guys cognizant of? What were you guys really thinking about when you're looking at, and the name as well?
I guess how to describe this, I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about how we wanted to present the product, and there are brands that I think do a very good job in the US given the limited visibility that they have. But like, there are brands like Asahi Shoes or like Dasai that does a very good job of articulating what the product is and what people should expect from that. Hakai-san is doing a tremendous job. Nambu Bijin is also, I mean, again, I'm biased by the fact that I'm in the market and I see what I want to see, essentially. But I mean, I like distilling the message of their product, highlighting the level of recognition that their products receive in the Japanese market and the US market, and kind of reinforcing why American consumers should give it a try. And the quality of those products is high, at least, so it's high. And so I mean, I think we've always had examples like that, but at the same time, I mean, from a marketing perspective, it gets back to what I mentioned to you guys earlier. It's like, how do we keep it simple? I mean, we are making sake in Brooklyn, right? And we are inspired by tradition, but I mean, we have the ability to take a slightly different path. And so we know a lot about sake, we know a lot about making sake, but we're never going to stop learning about those things. And so, I don't know, we try and embed that in the marketing, essentially, and the definition of our brand, and why we have such a range of products. There isn't like one style that we produce. Now, for distribution in New York City, we have essentially two styles of sake, a junmai and a junmai genjo. But in our tap room, we have sometimes 7 to 9 different types of sake, different yeasts, different fermentation profiles, different stages in the process, whether it be shibortate or post kind of additional settling and filtration sake, which dramatically changes to namachozo, right? Sake that's been pasteurized in bottle, all of which like yields a very different final product, and is fun to show people that like those levers exist, assuming a certain baseline level of quality in the production process. So we really haven't arrived at a flavor profile necessarily. I mean, we do produce for distribution 2 styles that move over time, and we are trying to achieve repeatability and consistency. What we've been very lucky about, and this is a testament to Brandon, is, I mean, even though there's movement in the kind of, whether it be the acidity or residual sugar of the sake, I mean, we've been super lucky that the quality has remained high. And I mean, as we kind of focus our effort, then it will also enable us to kind of experiment more as well. So I guess to both those questions, like marketing branding is a huge deal. It's very much product driven, but it's how we message the product that both to our many audiences. Like I mentioned, I think about things in terms of from a sales perspective in 3 general levels. Like you have the distributors you might want to sell to, you have the buyers that you might want to sell to, and then you have the final consumers, all of which have a different level of sophistication and expectations. But we also have other audiences. To your point, we have a whole audience of craft producers, whether they be sake, beer, or fine wine, that are interested in sake. Those folks exist in the US and in Japan. And because we're in New York City, we get a disproportionate level of attention from Japan, whether we deserve it or not, right? Which has been helpful, but also intimidating in some respects.
Are there any brewing traditions that maybe you picked up in Japan that you try to honor in the US, or you feel a pressure to honor, or in the opposite way, have you kind of ripped up the rule book and kind of gone, no, we're not going to do it the way they do it. We're not going to try and go out of our way to do it the way they do it in Japan.
I mean, I'm brewing with Brandon less and less as, but what I'd say is our ethos is when we make a more traditional style of sake, more close to what's produced in Japan. And in order to do that, I mean, you can't mess with the process too much. I mean, you can make different decisions, but like as a result, I mean, our process from the moment rice gets into our facility to the moment we are filtering and packaging really does follow the life cycle of a brewery that you would see here. And maybe we're using equipment that we source from Italy or from Germany, but the goals, that equipment itself is designed to do very similar things.
I was thinking more of like cultural traditions. So, you know, for example, I don't know, do you have a little sigidama outside your building, or do you have a little altar in how do you respect any of the religious aspects of brewing, or carry any of the kind of prayers out before brewing and after brewing? Or
so we respect all of the aspects, but we don't practice them.
Okay.
I think it's very important to us that we maintain the integrity of our cultural identity, respect the process. So that's why my answer to your question is really related to the process itself, which we do respect tremendously, and the brewers that have been doing this for generations in Japan. But like the layer of cultural kind of traditions that sit on top of the process, we don't spend a lot of time with, both because, I mean, it gets back to we're not Japanese, we don't speak Japanese,
right.
I mean, think about beer and wine production in the UK or in the US, right?
Well, a lot of that is really grown organically in its own ecosystem
Exactly, yeah.
because it had its own, right?
Yeah. And it's a pretty secular thing. I don't know how to describe it in any other way. It's like agnostic to like culture, even though there's culture that has developed and there are traditions that every brewery has, but us kind of importing like some of the cultural traditions associated with brewing sake, I think in my mind, and I think Brandon's as well, wouldn't kind of be consistent with like what we're trying to achieve, which is we are American craft producers. And it's really about process integrity that matters to us. I think that doesn't change the fact, like I said, that I mean, we adopt language that's used in breweries across Japan, and I think that's an important thing for us. But as far as like kind of religious, like shrines or the Sugidama, I don't see that in our future.
When you're on a menu with the brands from Japan, you feel there's a pressure there that you have to kind of deliver a particular, quality or flavor.
I mean, if we can't be side by side with sake from Japan and have people choose us as often as they choose other like sakes on the table, then we're not doing a good job. I mean, ultimately, then we're not delivering on what the expectations we've set for the company. So, I mean, there are sake lists and we should be on them, and people should have a choice, like drinking locally, something produced locally, and something more traditional from Japan, both of which offer a great outcome, a delicious drink.
For the feedback you've heard so far, do you think with the audience in the US or in Brooklyn, you think that the audience is kind of differentiating between sake from Japan and sake in the US? Are they drawing a line between the two? And do they kind of, have you experienced any problems in trying to, market your sake and people kind of always comparing it to sake in Japan? Or because those are the problems that personally I would think would exist, right, in a country which already is importing, sake from Japan. And
You got to remember, a lot of people there still don't have enough sake experience to even really go up against anything.
Exactly.
There's not even enough preconception there to really be. You're not even really butting up against. I don't think a whole lot at the moment.
I think that's a great articulation.
Yeah.
It's like in a world. I mean, we have a real bias. I mean, the three of us, we are in the sake market and believe that probably the sake market is more significant than really it is, at least from a U.S. or British consumer perspective or German consumer perspective. And so, I don't know. There are always going to be people that say, hey, I only want to drink French wine, or I only want to drink Belgian beer. But I mean, that's fine. Good for them. Like buy a bunch of it. Yeah. But those are not necessarily the people we're trying to win over. And if those were the only people we were retailing to or selling to or trying to educate, then the market would stay the same size forever.
And I mean this in the nicest, best way possible. 20 years from now, ideally, it won't even be a conversation, right? So if you're looking at sake production long term and sort of developing the market and developing the culture, is that it's sort of a conversation that maybe comes up given the ecosystem of Japan and sort of Japan looking at international and U.S. market. But for you guys, if you're, as you're saying, you're getting into creating something that is, that is honest, that is true to its truth, but also unique to what you guys are doing, that's there's going to be another probably 10 breweries pop up in the next year or two. There's going to be another 10 after that. There's going to be another 10 after that. And then honestly, if Japan doesn't get on their game, the sake markets in the U.S. is going to be dominated by U.S. sake, which, I mean, you see... In
a way, you have the kind of old world, new world situation, in the wine industry.
Just a matter of time.
It's only a matter of time. You're going to be the Napa Valley of the sake world, maybe. But just to add to my question, what I was really thinking more about is kind of the price point. How do you handle the price point? Do you try and match the ones coming from Japan, or are you happy going below and, you think people will understand that it's being made in the US, so obviously it's not going to be as expensive as stuff being imported?
I mean, that's just from an economic perspective, it's really tough to justify a business like this unless you're generating a certain revenue per unit, right? And I think I've approached pricing with really three things in mind. One is I want to be respectful, and I know this isn't like the best business approach to, at least in the short term. I think in the medium term it really is, but I want to be respectful to the fact that there are some great imported sakes in the U.S. market, and I don't want to have a conversation with someone that like, why is our sake produced in Brooklyn more expensive than a 25th generation Daiginjo? It doesn't produced by it doesn't make sense for me to have to. So that informs our pricing strategy. The second thing is we want our bottles to be premium, because of the level of craftsmanship and effort and energy that goes into every bottle. We think that they deserve a place beyond kind of what your table sake or futsushu would retail at in the U.S., right? And then third, we do want people to purchase our sake thinking about it in the same quality band as imported Japanese sake. So that means our pricing, well, it's not as high as I would like, right? But I think it's responsible for the first two reasons that I gave you, is really at like the entry level import price point in the US market. And I think kind of that says a lot about what we're trying to achieve. So it's respectful. It kind of maintains that premium perspective and perception that reflects the craftsmanship, energy, and effort that goes into every unit or bottle that we produce. And it keeps us in this kind of sphere of thinking that is linked to Japanese produced sakes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds like you're handling it
Absolutely.
perfectly. I think I'd just like to ask one final question, or perhaps wrap it up quite nicely. What do you see the chat like going forward? What do you see the main challenges?
So for us, it's doing this in the U.S. market is challenging practically without the infrastructure and the active support, whether it be the equipment industries or the kind of the supply chain. So it's just making sure those things are stable enough for us to conduct our business. And then it's about maintaining the quality and integrity of the product that we want to produce. And then doing that at a scale that justifies starting this business. So I think we've been super lucky. I don't know how to reinforce that. It's just been crazy how amazing folks have been, whether it be like I said, Gartner or the folks at Mutual or folks at Wismatech or are the people that are in the thick of the industry and have been in it for 20 years operating in New York City, or be breweries across Japan that are visiting us and sharing little like moments of wisdom with us to help improve our process and our messaging. So as long as that continues and we don't mess up that, I think we'll be okay.
You're going to be fine.
We're going to be all right.
You're going to be doing.
Yeah, we're going to be cool.
I'm not worried about you.
I mean, I spend time worrying about us, but I mean, ultimately,
that's part of the job description.
It is. Yeah, it is. But ultimately, we've been super lucky.
Yeah. As everything kind of starts to kind of stabilize and all that. You said you don't spend quite as much time brewing, and you're out and about a little bit more. You can venture out to the island a little more, and
yeah, it's funny. I think one of the things that's important to me personally is that we're training a lot of people in how to produce sake. Brandon's super talented, and I think there's some benefit to having a pipeline of talented people for our company. But also, those people are going to be a part of that wave of folks that are starting new breweries and help kind of the industry itself grow, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like
it's fun times ahead.
It's fun times ahead. I mean, it's interesting. I'm in Japan talking to you guys. Yeah. That's pretty cool.
So there's worse ways to spend a Sunday morning.
Sake on air. That's all right. But cool. I appreciate this. This is pretty awesome. It's cool to be in this building and among all these beautiful sakes. I'm sorry, folks on the podcast can't see this, but
we'll find a way to share the experience.
Oh, there are pictures.
Share the love.
Right?
There's ways we can make it happen.
Technology exists.
Say we've got the means.
Yeah, that's great.
So, very good.
Yeah, cool. Thanks,
Brian.
guys.
Thank you so much for taking time
That's
and come and join us for a drink. We'll have to do this again.
Definitely.
We'll catch up with you, whether it be here or maybe in New York next time. We'll bring the equipment and we'll
Let's do it.
on the side.
Let's do it.
Excellent.
And just, I guess the one thing I'd say, thank you to everyone who's been supportive of us, and I mean has been patient as we try and develop this product with a focus on a respect for Japan and the tradition and process here, with a real ambition to grow sake globally. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Looking forward to what's going to happen here.
Awesome. Cool.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Brian.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Sake on Air. As always, please send your questions, feedback, and show ideas to questions@sakeonair.com. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Sake on Air. Sake on Air is made possible with the generous support of the Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association and is a joint production between POTS K Productions and Export Japan. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review to help us share the sake love with more listeners like yourself. Kanpai!